Hello, welcome to the bleh. Hello, this is Hitcoder, and today's tutorial is on making your first platformer game in the Enigma development. Let me try in English. Take two. Hello everybody, this is Hitcoder, and today I will be teaching you how to make your first platformer game in the Enigma development environment. Now, first things first, we'll need a room, a sprite, and an object. Now, this sprite will be the player sprite. Let's create a 32 by 32 object. And for now, let's just make it a circle. We'll fill it in red for now. Save, click OK. And if we head back to Enigma, there we go. That's our player, and we shall use the player sprite. Now, if we look at the sprite, we can set the collision mask to automatic, and I'm going to use rectangle for now. Now, this is all good. Let's name our sprite. And then let's name our object. And for now, we'll leave that and put it to one side. And now in the settings for the room, we'll call it room main or level. Now, next thing we'll want to do is create a resource, SPR block. We're going to add a sprite. Let's make it 32 by 32. And let's make this one gray. You can texture it however you want. I will probably be adding a corner. And maybe like this. Save, and we're going to make another object. Object block. Now, let's make this object solid. Now, in our player object, we want to create some variables. Now, player speed equals, and we can set this to how fast we want the player to move. For now, I will set this to 3. Now we want to set gravity, player gravity, or player grav equals, let's say 0.25. And then player jump equals, let's say 5. Now, in our normal step, and I believe we can open both of these at the same time. There we go. So we have these variables for reference. And now, we can make some controls. For now, let's say input left equals VK left. Input right equals VK right. Now, VK means virtual keyboard. Left means the left arrow key. Right means the right arrow key. Input jump equals VK space. If you would like to use letters, you can use ORD X. This will say the letter X. I'll demonstrate that later. Now, let's say we have gravity, and now we need player vertical momentum equals 0. And now in the step event, we want to increase player vertical momentum plus equals player grav. And in the room, if we place the player, also object block needs to have the sprite assigned. Save. And let's place some blocks. There we go. So for now, we won't implement collisions just yet. I'm going to comment this out for the time being. Now, if keyboard check, this is a check for a keyboard being input each frame. Keyboard check will check if the key is being held down and not for the initial press event or the initial release event. This will just check if the key is being held. If keyboard check and we want input left. Now this if the left arrow key is being held down. If the left arrow key is being held down, we want the X position to be have player speed subtracted from it. And then if keyboard check input left, input right, X plus equals player speed. So if we save these and then we run our game, so this is also very good because it will tell us where anything goes wrong. It's a little bit of a complicated dialogue to wrap your head around, as this is a C++ level compiler. So the ENIGMA engine converts that code into C++, and as such, it compiles C++. Sometimes we'll run into errors where plugins are enabled that are not working correctly, as this is open source software that is always receiving updates, which means that sometimes things may be broken that people are not aware of. Often this means we have to disable certain plugins that just don't really add much in the first place. The first compile will always take longer than the following compiles. And this is the first time I have compiled a game in ENIGMA on this installation. So it has to set up a bunch of things built into the engine first. Once some of these things are compiled and set up, they're already compiled for future reference, and therefore it only has to compile things that are changed by our code. So for now, we are just waiting for the entire process to complete. And as this will take a while, I'm going to pause the recording. So now, as we can see, there is an error because the circle is moving right even whilst we are not pressing the right arrow key. Keyboard check, input right. If we replace this with VK right, it should function the same way, but we will double check. As often, debugging is trial and error, but as we can see, it is still not working correctly. And I just realized that I typed it in the wrong place. If you noticed that prior, well done. You're probably a better programmer than most people. No, I'm kidding. Anyway, I do not know how I overlooked that. I have no clue how I managed to do that, but I apologize. Anyway, that was a particularly painful mistake. And there we go, left, right. And then if we press both of them, it doesn't move at all. Now, you may have noticed that this game is in 30 FPS. If we want it in 60, we should change the speed to 60. This means that free pixels in a step will feel twice as fast now, because a step is 1 frame. So as you can see, smooth 60 FPS. Technically we could run it faster, but some machines wouldn't be able to handle that. So as you can see, we have our left and right movement. Now, if we uncomment this line, and run the game, we'll see the player start to fall. And that's when we realized that we didn't actually tell the player to move based on this momentum. So, at the end of our step, let's do y plus equals player v momentum. Save and run. There we go, and as you can see, the player fell through the floor. How do we fix this? Well, before we fix it, something is annoying me about this, and you may have seen it too. But if we move these, you'll see that some of them are aligned in the wrong position, and I don't know why that happened. So I'm going to erase all of them, and I'm going to just add new ones manually. And I believe what happened is that as I held shift and drew them on the screen, it added one for each individual cell, in which there are 2 per block. Regardless, this is resolved. Let's move on. Now, we want this to happen every frame, but we need to completely set the player momentum, vertical momentum, to 0 when the player collides with a block. How do we do that? If now, as the player can reach particularly high vertical momentum speeds, let's cap it first. So, to do that, let's say player Vmax equals, and let's say we want to make sure the player doesn't go any faster than 16 pixels per frame. If absolute player v momentum is greater than or equal to, actually we'll just do if it's greater than player v max, then player vertical momentum equals player v max. Now the issue with this is that we are setting it to 16, but if the player is moving upwards at a rate of 24 and we set it to 16, the player is starting to move downwards. Now, to prevent that from happening, we multiply this by sine player v momentum. Sine refers to the plus or minus of this variable, and if we're multiplying it by -1, then it will be a upwards value, and if we're multiplying it by +1, then it will be a downwards value, because up on the screen is negative and down on the screen is positive, because the origin of a screen is the top left at 0, 0, and therefore bottom right is plus 1920 by negative 1080. But that's just on the screen. Anyway, next we want to check collision line. Now collision line is a very good way to check based on a speed value. Now what we want to do is check if the next frame will cause us to be on the ground or through the ground. So to do that, we need to do collision line x, y, so that is the start of the line, and then x plus just x, and then y plus player v momentum. The object we want to check for a collision with is object block precise, we'll set to false. Not me refers to if this is true, then if object block is an instance of object player, then this will return false. So this is not really relevant. We can set it to true or false. It won't make a difference. Now, we're checking collision line. So if the player is going to collide with that object, you want to set player vertical momentum to 0. Now, this will cause some issue, and you'll see what it is when we run the game. And as you can see, there's another issue that I didn't think about, and that reminds me that I would like to center the origin for both of these. Now, as we are moving from the origin of the player, we ideally would like to check from the position of the player's bounding box. So we're going to change y to b box bottom. And this may incorporate some issues, but we'll work with it. Interesting. So as you can see, the player has landed on this surface. But before that happened, you may have noticed that the player stopped in midair before then landing. Now, this is because it detected that the floor was going to be collided with in the next frame, then set the momentum to 0, which was potentially could have been at 9, could have been at 16, which means that the distance between the player and the floor could have been up to 16 pixels. And because of that, it would have stopped the player because we didn't move the player to that position first. Now, the reason we can't move the player to that position first is because it could potentially end up being inside the floor, which is not what we want. So, ideally, we want to set the player's Y position to the distance. So, the bounding box bottom is 31 pixels. Now, there are many ways we could tackle this, but what we could do is set the player vertical momentum to the distance between we could set the player's vertical momentum to the distance between these. And we can have a look at how that would work. Oh no, it didn't work. Why? Okay. So, as half of the player's sprite is 16 pixels, we're going to set the vertical momentum to 0, then we're going to set Y equals instance position X by Y. So we'll use this so that we have an idea of what we're using. So X is the same as the player. If there's an instance, well, Y equals instance position. So the instance at this position, so plus player vertical momentum, the instance of object block, and then we'll use dot bbox top. But actually we would also like to subtract 16 from that. I'm expecting this to be off by a pixel or something, because I'm not very good at programming games and I don't know why I'm making a tutorial. Oh, there we go, perfect. It works amazingly. Awesome. So, now we want to make another variable so that we know if we can jump off of the... Okay. So Actually, if that so let's make a variable called on ground equals false. On ground equals that. On ground, and then if on ground or, those two lines mean or, player vertical momentum is equal to 0, and then we want to say, okay, actually, you know what? Let's just... let's say that this variable is equal to this state. And now, if keyboard check pressed, input jump, and on ground, and now we'll set player vertical momentum to player jump. So that means when we press the button whilst we're on the ground, the player will jump. Knowing my programming for games, at least, this probably will not work. I'm good at backend, not games. And as you can see, there is something severely wrong. And that's when we realize we made a fatal mistake. That's when I realized I made a fatal mistake. Player jump is a positive value because I wanted this to be simplified for development purposes. We need to set it to negative player jump to go upwards. What a silly mistake. The moral of the story is don't be me. There we go. And now we can jump. Red circle boy can jump. That's pretty poggers. Why can we jump whilst in the air? Sometimes we can jump and sometimes we can't. I don't understand what's going on, but okay. Cool. What if we set this, instead of keyboard check pressed, keyboard check, which means that if we hold the jump button down, the player will jump every time it's on the ground whilst the button's held. This is a personal preference thing. It's up to you. Clearly something is wrong when it's... So in case you didn't already guess, on ground is checking if we're at 0 vertical momentum, which isn't what we want because the player reaches 0 vertical momentum whilst in the air. So we will do this, and instead of player vertical momentum, bbox bottom plus 1. There we go, we should have functional jumping. Perfect, that's great. Okay. Now, we could set the player jump to a higher number. I'm going to set it to 8, and we could make it so that if you release the jump button whilst you're going upwards, it stops your jump, meaning that you jump higher depending on how long you hold the button down for. So, if keyboard check released input jump, and player vertical momentum is less than, let's say, less than 0 in any way, player vertical momentum equals 0. This means that when we release the jump button, the player will immediately start falling instead of going up, which might be a little bit ugly feeling, but you know, it's a form of so as you can see, when we release the button, the player starts falling. I didn't mean to run it again. Okay, so alternatively, another way we could tackle that is by going to, instead of keyboard check released, we could do keyboard check and we could set it to, if jump is not being held down and the player is going up, then player vertical momentum plus equals player grav, which means that gravity is doubled if you're going upwards. Oh, oops. I must have made an error. Let's see. Oh. I put equals plus equals, which is not a valid syntax. There we go. Awesome. I'm going to change my jump factor again. I'm going to change it to 6. And I'm also going to go back and set keyboard check to keyboard check pressed. Now, this is where we can make a more complex level design and also adjust the size of the viewport. So, let's make the room quite big. Let's say the room is 4K and 2K. And then we can start building a level. very quickly. So let's change this to 32 by 32. And I'm going to put the player in about here. So for now, these are some basic platforms, and we're going to add a view. We want our view and the viewport. Viewport will be 640 by 480. We want it to follow the player object. The border, we want it to be 320 by 240, which should make the player always central. If we run this now, cool. We have a view that follows the player. We have bottom collisions but not top collisions, which means we can technically jump through our platforms. Oops. For some reason our jump button's not working correctly sometimes. So anyway, that's a very, very basic platformer. You can add enemies, etc, etc. But this is a very, very rudimental basic platformer, and that's all I'm really here for today. I hope this was helpful in some way. Thank you for watching, and goodbye.